Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 19th of January of 2023. Today we have some updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with the Kupiansk and Lyman front line from this area. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes, as a result of the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 30 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and something around 2 artillery systems, Akatse. And the Russians reported that, as they did before, as they're doing these days since the previous week, the Russians were attacking 14th Mechanized Brigade on the Kupiansk-Lyman area and the 92nd Mechanized Brigade in this area. When talking about the hot point in this front line, of course, the Novoselysk, this town is the place where we can find the heaviest clashes on this front line. Furthermore, if you remember, somewhere in the end of December, the Russians reported that they managed to penetrate and break through this area and push the Ukrainians back from Novoselysk in direction of Berestova, but during January, the Western countries reported and the Russians confirmed that the Ukrainians managed to start counteroffensive operation. They managed to push the Russians back on, let's say, east side of this railroad, and Novoselysk is in the gray zone, but when talking about some kind of racial proportion, I believe that the Ukrainians controls something around 60 or 70%, and the Russians just 40-30% in this area. So when talking about this area, the clashes in this area works in Ukrainian favor. I'm not talking about the losses, I'm talking about the situation on the ground. When talking about the losses, I believe that the Ukrainians have more losses than the Russians, at least on the Kupiansk front line. When talking about Lyman front line, there is the same picture as we saw yesterday. The Russians attacks 95th Storm Assault Brigade and 24th Mechanized Brigade in this area. 24th Brigade is located on the north of Makeyevka, and the Russians attacking this area. To be more precise, they're not attacking. The Ukrainians made few attempts of counteroffensive operation, but they were spotted and they were covered by the artillery systems. And as a result of those clashes or artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost something around 60 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 1 howitzer D-20. Furthermore, the Ukrainians lost ammo depot in the area of Nevskaya, according to the Ministry of Defense, and also the Russians attacking the same brigades, 95th and 24th. So no more updates. As you can see, the situation is very complicated on the Kupiansk-Lyman front line. When talking about Kupiansk, the losses in this area are not so high. When talking about Lyman, it's the second, or sometimes it's the first front line in comparison with the other front lines. When talking about the losses of Ukrainian soldiers, but anyway, the combat line is stable. The Russians, we understand that they need to start doing something in this area to get as fast as possible to Lyman. The Ukrainians need to storm Crimea, but nothing changes from day to day. I believe that sooner or later something is going to change in this area, but for now we see what we see. Now let's talk about, let's say, Siversk Salidar front line from this area. I believe that now when talking about Siversk, it's completely another front line. Now it used to be the same front line with the Bakhmut, but because of the fact that the supply roads between these two towns were cut off by the Russians, I believe that Siversk is the completely separate front line, and the Russians pushes in this area from the south. Today, during the day, the Russians reported that they managed to got as close as possible to Sporne. They managed to move along these brushes, along these forests, this line to the north, and now this like in the vicinity of Sporne. But Sporne is still under Ukrainian control. The main difficulties of Sporne is that there is a gas station with a lot of, underground gas reservoirs. So the Ukrainians are able to hide vehicles, ammo, and shells in this area. So it's very difficult for the Russians to push the Ukrainians back from this area. But anyway, the Russians understand that they need to push. And the Russians understand that when talking about the entire Ukrainian front line, or all the front lines, the Russians understand that Siversk is the most tasty piece of cake. It's the easiest target in this special operation, at least for now, and I believe that they will try to complete Siversk story by the time when spring comes, and they will try maybe to encircle, maybe just to force the Ukrainians to step back or something like this. But anyway, this is the most important target during the spring. Of course, Bakhmut may be more important than Siversk, but Bakhmut is a very long story, and I'm not sure that the Russians are able to take Bakhmut before spring comes. It's very complicated and maybe by the end of the winter the Russians will be able to take, but Siversk is the much easiest target than the Bakhmut. So the Ukrainians attacks direction of Sporny, Vanodarivka, Vyimka, Veselaya, Razdolovka, Krasnopolovka, but without any changes on the ground. For now, the front lines, they are not stable. The Ukrainians, I believe, they're in defense state and they're doing everything they can. But it's not the question of whether the Ukrainians are able to hold these positions or not. It's the question of time, how long it will take for the Russians to take control over this fortification line. Krasnopolovka, Razdolovka, Veselaya, and Sporny. Anyway, sooner or later, I believe Krasnopolovka will fall, Razdolovka, Veselaya, and after that, we can start discussion, some kind of operational encirclement of Siversk. But for now, no changes. When talking about Bakhmut, there are very heavy clashes in Krasnaya Gora. The Russians attacked this town from the south, from Blagodatne, Podgorodnya, from Salidar, from the north, from fields in the east side, but the Ukrainians are still there. It is very difficult to understand which part of Krasnaya Gora is under Russian control, which part is under Ukrainians. I believe that this map is not updated. Some streets or blocks of this small village is under Russian control, some of them under Ukrainians. I believe that this village will fall anyway, and very soon, by the way, maybe even by the end of this week. But for now, we see what we see, and the Ukrainians still there. They still control this area, and of course, as soon as Krasnaya Gora falls, the Russians will be able to turn their focus and to change their focus on Paraskovyevka and Blagodatne, and I believe that they will try to develop this bridgehead as well. It's also just a question of time, how long it will take to take this area for the Russians. I believe that it won't take much time. The Ukrainians are moving more and more reserves to this area, trying to stop and pin down the Russians. And from one side, it gives them some time. But for another side, they're losing a lot of soldiers and their losses are very high. And the Ukrainian losses, the number of Ukrainian losses, not just the number, but the fact that they're very high, is confirmed. This information is confirmed by the Russian sources and by the Western sources, by the Ukrainians themselves. Anyways, the Ukrainians started another wave of mobilization, and they're planning to mobilize another 100,000 soldiers. They're planning to do this by spring, by the time when they receive the majority of the armored vehicles and Western weapon. But I see that when talking about the special operation, the global scope, some sources are saying that Ukrainians need to receive this Western weapon for one purpose, to start their own counteroffensive operation. But something tells me that by the time they receive this Western weapon, the only thing that the Ukrainians will be able to do is to defend themselves, but with the modern weapon, because I don't see the Ukrainian reserves to start any offensive operation in the territory of Ukraine in the upcoming future. Maybe I'm wrong. Now let's talk about Bakhmut. As you can see, the Russians have updated their map. First of all, they are showing a few icons on the east part of Bakhmut that they managed to cross a few streets on the east side. Furthermore, the Russians managed to develop their progress from the south, from Oputne. Oputne is very far from their back and behind them, and now they're inside Bakhmut in the residential area. They're moving from the south, and furthermore, yesterday evening there was another update from the north area. There is a small industrial area. There is some kind of meat factory in this area, and the Russians managed to penetrate and to develop some bridgehead on the north as well. Let's return back to the Western sources map, and I believe so. These days, the Russians attacks from Oputne in this area, and I believe that they are somewhere on the edge of this arrow. When talking about east side, they're also pushing, and they're also somewhere on the edge of this arrow. And another attack, the Russians attacks from the north, and they're also somewhere on the edge of this area. So as you can see, they're attacking from three sides. trying to force the Ukrainians to leave this bridgehead and to cross the river. And today we got one of the most important updates about Bakhmut. As you can see, the town by the name of Klishchiivka has fallen, and the Russians now they're showing their flag on this town. That means that this small village is under Russian control, but everything is not so good as you might think, because Klishchiivka is very important, of course. But when talking about this entire fortification, we need to. There are at least four fortifications that we know. First one is on the south. This one, this fortification is located on the west side of this canal. Another fortification almost at the same place, but on the east side of this canal. Another fortification is the Klishchiivka itself, and the fourth fortification, the most important one, is located on the entrance in this town, this one. And this very nice fortification, as you can see, there is like a forest from the northeast, forest from the south and southwest, and there are a lot of trenches as well in this area, so it's not an easy job to penetrate this area and to take control. But anyway, the Russians got as close as possible. I believe that these days the Russians establish the most important thing, they establish fire control over this road. Not with maybe with the heavy artillery, but even furthermore, they establish fire control with the mortars, just regular infantry mortars. So we can say that they establish physical control. If you are able to establish mortar control, that means that you control this area physically. And I believe that the Ukrainians lost their supply and support in this area. But when talking about the Ukrainians, they have almost the same picture. They are able to control the Russians, and they are able to pin down them with the mortar fire. So the clashes there are very heavy. But the fact that the Russians got this village, I believe that in a day or in a two, they will be able to take control over these trenches as well. And that means that the Russians, by taking all these four fortifications, by that they will be able to establish a very powerful bridgehead on the south of Chasov Yar. This one. It will be a very powerful bridgehead with many trenches, and of course they will try to improve. If the Russians are not able to take control over Bakhmut by the end of the winter, I believe if they understand that something goes wrong and they need more time to take control over this area. But anyway, even if they take Bakhmut by the end of the spring, they still need to take control over Chasov Yar, Konstantinovka. So anyway, by taking this bridgehead, I believe that the Russians will try to improve this area, because they need this base as the main area to attack in direction of Chasov Yar, Konstantinovka, in operation of encirclement and creation of the cauldron in Donetsk New York agglomeration. Furthermore, as you can see, the Russians these days started some movements, some kind of recon combat in direction of Belgorod, Delivka. So all these operations we're going to see very soon. And the situation for the Ukrainians is critical in this area, but anyway, they still hold this position. Another important thing about Klishchiivka and about this fortification, as soon as the Russians establish control over this fortification, they will be able to get these forests and these brushes. I believe that there are also Ukrainian positions. I believe that the Russians, it will take some time to push the Ukrainians back from this position to demine this area, but as soon as they get there, let's update this map just for you to understand what I'm talking about. But as soon as the Russians get there, they will be able to protect their flanks, their let's say left flank, and from this area they will start their movements on the southwest of Bakhmut, and furthermore from these forests they will be able to make some effective targeting over this road N32. And we can say that this road will be under fire control. Just the distance between this road and the Russians is just 2 kilometers, 2.68 kilometers. That means that they will be able to establish a lot of different types of control over this area, not physical, but a lot of types of weapon, tanks, mortars, and many other types of weapon will be able to attack this area. The Russians need to solve, and they need to hurry up in Krasnogor, Poroskovivka area. They need to take this territory as fast as possible, because as you can see from the south, they have some progress. They have stuck a little bit in Krasnogor. The Ukrainians understand the value of this town, the value of, I will update this map. This blue cloud is the very important bridgehead that Ukrainians need to hold, and the Russians need to take control over. This blue cloud can determine the entire destiny of Bakhmut, and not just the destiny of Bakhmut. It will determine the time, how long it will take the Russians to take the control over this area. So the Russians need, this is the vital area. They need to find some kind of balance between losses among their soldiers and the time they need to spend for this operation. They need to spend as less as possible and to have as less as possible losses. But anyway, for now they stuck in Krasnogora. And as soon as the Russians establish bridgehead in this area, from this moment they will establish physical fire, even physical control over this supply road. And from that moment, the Ukrainians are going to have just one road in this area on the east, just strict road in the east. To tell the truth, it will be already operational, even maybe tactical encirclement of Bakhmut. Yes, the Ukrainians still have some road to supply, but the Russians will be able to cover this area with all types of artillery they have, even without targeting. They're 24 hours per day just to attack in this direction without aiming, without targeting. Of course, there are going to be some drones, and some of these drones will be taken off by the Ukrainian radars and so on, but anyway they will be able to see something there, and they, as I told you, they don't need to see anything. They just need to cover this area 24 hours per day without any stop, without any rest, from different positions. And of course it will bring some success, and a week, 2 or 3 weeks of such fire, and Bakhmut will fall, and the Ukrainians won't be able to even evacuate from this area. And as you can see, there are not much left before this situation. Klishevka has already fallen. Just one trenches. It will take time, maybe a week, maximum a week, to take control over these trenches, over this fortification and this forest as well. And I have more questions about the north part, about Krasnogora, Paraskovivka, Blagodatna. I think that this small agglomeration will take more time. I'm not sure that the Russians are able to establish full control over this territory in a week, because they need to cross the railroad. Furthermore, there are 2 railroads in this area, as you can see, and it's not an easy job. Furthermore, if the Russians plans to cross the railroads, I believe that they will do this somewhere in on the north, on the railroad station Sol, and after that they will try to move to the south to Blagodatovka, and then they will move closer and closer to this road, so it's like safe. And of course this pass might take a lot of time, but we understand that it's worth it. It's worth the destiny that it worth, and Bakhmut may fall, but how long it will take? I believe that in a month everything will be done, but it's a month. It's like 9th of January, and somewhere on the 20th of February the Ukrainians will start to receive maybe Western weapon, and they will be able to move this weapon to the front line, and it will cause another damage and another pressure on the Russian army. When talking about Donetsk, the Ukrainians lost around 80 soldiers in this area. The Ukrainians lost something around 6 armored vehicles, and the Ukrainians lost a lot of artillery systems. When talking about the artillery system, the main losses is on Donetsk. Let's say it's very difficult to say when we're saying Donetsk front line. Sometimes, according to the Ministry of Defense, that means that it's the front line from Bakhmut to Donetsk. I believe that when talking about Bakhmut, it's like Wagner front line or Bakhmut front line. But when talking about Donetsk, I believe that it's the area, let's say, from Marinka to Avdiivka. So it's like to better understand the situation. I believe it's better, much better. So when talking about Donetsk, the Ukraine lost 3 Caesar artillery system, 1 Gvozdika, 2 Akatsiya, and also the Ukrainian lost Raider NTPQ-15 Kurakhov. They lost a lot of artillery systems. So as you can see, the Russians continue effective artillery duels. They made few attempts of storming Nivoyska, but they were forced to step back. No more updates from Marinka. As you understand, the Russians still there. They're stuck a little bit, and not much left to get the outskirts of the edge of Marinka. But I'm not sure what price the Russians will pay to cross the last 100 meters. A little bit better situation near Vadian and Opotna. The Russians tried to short the front line to develop their position, but anyway, all these small villages is like 100 complete fortifications, and you need to understand, as I understand, it's my opinion, I'll give you my opinion. when talking about all these towns around Donetsk, like Первомайская, Водяная, Опытная, Авдеевка, Маринка, Krasnogorovka, Maximilianovka, Georgievka, Novomikhailivka, the Russians attacks in this area with one purpose, as I understand. They don't need these towns to penetrate or to attack in this area and then to encircle some group and to meet with Bakhmut forces somewhere in Pokrovsk or something like this. No, the only thing that the Russians want to achieve near Donetsk is just to push the Ukrainians as far as possible, and with this to push the Ukrainians' artillery positions as far as possible as well, to reduce the number of artillery attack again over Donetsk and so on. This is the only reason, because there are a lot of Ukrainian targeting position in this town around Donetsk who try to navigate and target the Donetsk with artillery fire. Also, when talking about howitzers, the Ukrainian uses Orlovka, Lastочкина, Тоненькая, Северная to bomb Donetsk. As you can see, Donetsk again under very heavy fire. There were no days since the beginning of the special operation. There were not even a day when the Ukrainians stopped attacking Donetsk by artillery systems. So the Russians just need to push them back as far as possible, and of course to reduce the number of Ukrainian artillery systems in this area. And this is the only reason why the Russians are losing their soldiers and pushing the Ukrainians in this area. If the Ukrainians, let's say, stopped attacking Donetsk by artillery, I don't know, somehow they decided not to attack Donetsk anymore, believe me, the Russians would stop at the same day to storm this area. They would stop and they would feel themselves very comfortable. But we see that Ukrainians attacks, they force the Russians to storm all this fortification, and of course the Russians have losses in this, very high losses in this area. When talking about South Donetsk area, as you can see, the front line is stable. There are not much changes. The Ukrainians made some counteroffensive operation in this area, but all those attacks were repulsed. The Ukrainians lost around 30 soldiers and something around 5 armored vehicles. Now let's talk about Zaporizhzhia area. When talking about Zaporizhzhia area and when talking about the Ukrainians, when talking about classic Zaporizhzhia area, there are two fortifications: Orechov fortification, as you know, and Gulyai-Polye fortification, and the Ukrainians base all their defense in this area on these two towns. There is another fortification, Velika Novosilovka, but I believe that this town is, when talking about South Donetsk area, this is the base defense town in this area. But when talking about Zaporizhzhia, this is two most important towns. And if you remember, right before the new year, Putin visited the South military district, and to maybe before his visit, the Russian military authority decided to make some kind of offensive operation. And as a result of that attack, the Russians established control over Dorozhnyanka. Then the Ukrainians made a few counter-offensive operations, but they couldn't return control over this town. So that was some kind of recall in combat made by the Russians, but at some point of this operation, they understood that they are able not just to make some break-off, but also they understood that they are able to take control over this village, and they did this. And that was very interesting. Very interesting. And when talking about today, the Russians reported about another offensive recall in combat in this area, and as a result of that recall in combat, the Russians managed to establish control over some number of checkpoints in this area as well, also without any clashes. And it is very interesting. As you can see, almost without clashes, almost without any pressure, almost without any, difficulties, the Russians takes town by town, checkpoint by checkpoint on Zaporizhzhia area, and without any problems. The Russians are saying that Ukrainians these minutes are planning to create some kind of small feast, and during the upcoming night they want to return control over this fortification. Tomorrow we'll see about the result, but if they are able to return, that means that everything is fine with Zaporizhzhia. But if they are not able to return control, that means that Ukrainians have a lot of problems in the Zaporizhzhia area. There are a lot of options why did it happen with these checkpoints around Orechov and so on, but at least I have two interesting options. The first one is that Ukrainians have collected a very powerful fist in Zaporizhzhia, and they just don't want to discover it. The same situation we saw in Kherson district, if you remember. The Russians, right before the greatest Ukrainian offensive operation in this area, the Russians managed to develop some bridgehead near Blagodatne. They managed to go as close as possible to Pervomaisk, and they published this information. They included this information in the Ministry of Defense report and so on. So they were very happy by those developments and so on. And now we see the same picture. And right in a few days later, the Ukrainians started their offensive operation. Of course, they were defeated near Davydov Brod. We know this. But when talking about Zaporizhzhia, we can say that we can see the same situation. The Russians got first down in Dorozhnyanka the last month. Even a month haven't passed since that moment. The Russians managed to get very close to Orekhov. So the first thing is that the Ukrainians have collected a very powerful fist in this area, very powerful, and they just don't want to be discovered, because they expect to receive an order and they will start pushing the Russians in this area. And this is the situation that plays in Ukrainian favor. And another option is that the things in Ukrainian army are so bad that all the military stuff in Ukrainian frontline, on the Zaporizhzhia frontline, are so bad, so the Ukrainians don't have even resources to repulse such a small attacks. And maybe the situation in the Zaporizhzhia area is the same situation as the Russians used to have in Kharkiv. So they, when say about facts, the Russians controlled or the Kharkiv area, but when the Ukrainians started offensive operation, in a week the Russians left all these territories almost without any clashes. They dropped their weapon, they dropped their armored vehicles, and the only thing they were doing is just running as fast as possible. Maybe these days we can see the same situation on the Zaporizhzhia area, because a lot of Western experts are saying that to stop collapse of frontline in Bakhmut, the Ukrainian military authorities were forced to redeploy all the forces from Zaporizhzhia area. It's around 15 brigades in direction of Artyomovsk, just to stop the Russians. As you can see, maybe this front line from the Ukrainian side, these have no blood anymore, and and now they are not even able to do anything. The Russians did one offensive operation, Break-in Combat, another one. The Western sources and the Russian sources are saying that the Russians managed to accumulate a lot of forces in Zaporizhzhia. Furthermore, the Russians managed to prepare at least 3 lines of defense in Zaporizhzhia. Even if the Russians are defeated in this area, anyway, they will be able to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive, a possible counteroffensive operation on the lines that they have already prepared. I don't know what is going to be in Zaporizhzhia, but all these activities from the Russian side tells me that maybe they're planning to start something in Zaporizhzhia, because now these days we are talking about greatest Russian offensive operation, as we did in August about the Ukrainians. Everybody were talking about the greatest Ukrainian offensive operation in Kherson, in Kharkiv area, and many other areas were talking, but nobody knew exactly where the Ukrainians would do this. At some point of time they started. Now we see the same picture, but from the Russian side. Everybody talks about greatest offensive operation from the Russian side. Nobody knows where exactly the Russians are planning to start this, but everybody knows that the Russian will do this 100%. So we'll see anyway, sooner or later we're going to see. I'll repeat to you one more time that in a month we'll see a year since the beginning of the special military operation, and I believe that according to the Russians' mentality, they will try to achieve some success before such a date, like a year of special operation. They need to provide something. They need to tell themselves that during a year they managed to achieve a lot, they managed to get a lot, they managed to take a lot, and they are able to develop this and to get more and more and more in the next year of the special military operation. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.